All right, so good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another lecture of cloud computing. Okay, so the first thing that we would like to discuss today is basically the research paper presentation task. Okay, so the whole idea of the task is that each one of you have been, or each one of your groups have chosen a research paper, which is one of the foundationally more famous research papers in the domain of cloud computing, right? It's in the past, but it's one of the most cornerstone papers that was there, right? So every group has chosen a work, right? And the idea is for you to read that paper and then create a presentation and then do a 40 minutes pre-recorded presentation, and then create a short summary document of whatever you have read and whatever you have understood from the paper, right? It's the short summary is around like 2 pages in PDF format, and then the pre-recorded presentation will need to have a link of your video recording, of course, and along with that, a PowerPoint presentation, which needs to be in PDF format as well, okay? And the link needs to be in the title slide of your PPT. Okay, these are requirements. This must be there. Okay, don't make me go looking for where your link is. So on your title side, your group name, your group members, right? And along with that, the link of your pre-recorded video. And this PPT needs to be in PDF format, not in any other format. And what you can do is essentially you can merge these two together, right? You can have the PPT first and then PDF and then submit a single file for submission. That is the overall expectation, right? Just to quickly go over the template for the summary, okay? Basic stuff, you need 1-inch margin on all slides, on sites, okay? And then it will be a single column, single space, single line space. And then in terms of font, please make sure that you either use Times New Roman or Arial. And as a result of that, the font size either will be 11 points and then 12 points. Okay, 2 pages tops, no more than that. All right, we don't need any reference for that summary page. Summary needs to be about the paper that you have read, essentially, right? And essentially, when you do the summary, you will have an abstract. Actually, not an abstract. You will need to have an extended abstract. Okay, which just doesn't summarize the paper, but also talks a little bit about the method that they have used, results that they have obtained, and highlight some of the important or key aspects of the results that they have obtained, essentially, right? What improvements they have received. And then after that extended abstract, you need to give your own critique. Okay. In the critique, you will discuss about what the authors or what the paper have done well. Okay, and then what could be improved. And these needs to be your own thoughts and relevant only with respect to the paper that you have read and not the domain in general. Does that make sense? Because when you have to provide ideas about what could be improved, you basically need to have an understanding of the state of the art, right? From there, you need to take the paper that you have read and then you need to extend it. But since you're not doing that, since you're not doing a survey, essentially your critique needs to be on the paper that you have read. So you can talk about the different things like, okay, maybe the simulation setup could have been explained better, right? Or maybe there could have been more in-depth discussions about one of the graphs that has been presented as a result. Instead of writing it as something that is evident to the readers, they could have pointed out about something that is not so evident to the eyes, right? Things like that. So critique the paper and not the domain. That is more important, okay? Thing to note here, a caution, is that don't use the author's thought as your own critique. If the authors are presenting some ideas that they have said that, okay, these are some of the assumptions due to that, these are the drawbacks of the work, and this is where things can be improved, don't express that as your own thought. Don't say we or I believe, and then write what the author said, right? Don't do that. Avoid doing that. Think of your own. So to do this, essentially what requires to happen is for you, after you have read the paper, discussed it as a group, to wait 2 or 3 days to let all the information that you have consumed to settle down. Once it has settled down, then you meet again, and then you discuss what your thoughts are on the paper. Then as a result of this activity, your basically you will hit a reset button, and then it will prevent you from taking other people's thought as your own. Right. So that is basically one of the ways in which you can avoid it's not a plagiarism per se, but falling into the trap when you are out of ideas and then you latch on to the immediate solution that falls in front of you, right? And not do that. So this is basically what the summary will entail, right? So you can probably give like a page and a half for the extended abstract, where you basically talk what the paper is about, what method has been proposed, how the method has been implemented, what have the authors done with respect to results and discussion, what kind of experiments have they performed, those kind of highlight, but in summarized version, right? So that will be around like give or take 700 words. Again, this is a reference. This is not like a strict word limit that you need to have your extended abstract by 700 words. This is where typically extended abstracts fall. A smaller abstract falls around 300 words. Even more compact ones are like 150 words if you have an executive stuff and all those things, right? But if you have an extended abstract, it's around 700, right? Close to a page, but not a full page, right? And then your summary, you can do it around like 300 to 500 words, right? Even better so if you can present it as a bullet list. I don't want to see paragraphs necessarily. This is not an essay. If you are precise and to the point, that's good enough for me, right? So that is what is more important on a technical report than writing paragraphs or writing stories. We are not doing storytelling, right? So keep that in mind. All right. So coming to the, where is it? The presentation. All right. So in order to do the presentation, you first have to understand what a research paper is all about. And then you basically have to reflect that understanding in your presentation, right? So this discussion right now is for those who have never studied a research paper before, right? Or have a lesser understanding as to what research entails and how to read a research paper, right? So typically, if you open any research paper, right, typically, sometimes you will see some differences, right, in the structure of it. A scientific research paper, especially in the field of computer science, starts with, of course, the title of the paper. And we are going very basic, right? This might sound pretty silly, but, you know, the title of the paper has its own importance because it is supposed to convey what the work is about, right? Sometimes you will see people have gone for like quirky titles, right? Which gives you no idea as to what this is about. Don't do that. It might sound cool, but it does not convey the information that is required, right? So a title of the paper is supposed to convey the context of the work that is being carried out. Okay, so that is why the title is important. Authorship is, of course, doesn't convey any information, but on the larger context of research, it gives you an idea of which research lab is working on that, so that if you're also interested in working in that particular domain, then that gives you a direct link on who to follow, so to speak, right? Everywhere is all about social media, right? So once you know the authors, you can basically check their other publications. So that is kind of like an important field. Their affiliations as well, in the same context, gives you an idea of which lab or which university is doing what kind of work and stuff like that. The other thing that is important is either at the top of the paper as a header or on the footer of the first page, you generally get the venue of the publication along with the year. These two are very important when you are either looking for research papers, and looking for research papers is something that will be, you know, you have to do when you're doing your project, right? Because you have to gather resources as much as you can, right? So when you gather your resources, you need like a initial filter, right? Not to decide whether you want to read that paper or not, or whether that paper is relevant for your project or not, but to have an understanding of whatever you find, let's say on platforms like Google Scholar, whether that work is important to us or not, right? So let's say you go here and then you open up Google Scholar. This is my go-to. There are other options as well. This kind of gives me an entry point into all of the other papers that I'm finding, right? So give me one topic from one of the groups.
Compact clusters.
Compact clusters. Okay. So compact clusters. All right. Let's put it in the context of cloud computing. All right. So we have some, but not all of them that are relevant. So here, when you're looking for survey, not survey, but when you're looking for a collection of resources that would be relevant for your project, and we are digressing a little bit from the research paper because this is kind of important, right? So you can see here, there is a time relevance at the left side, right, which gives you an idea. There is always something that is known as the freshness or the relevancy of a research. If it's too old, then the question comes up, why are you doing that, right? Let's say if you come up, if you refer to a paper that is published in, let's say 2000, right, and nothing in between has been done, and suddenly you say that, oh, you did research in 23, and you refer to something that is almost 23 years old, right? So any reviewer will question that, right? In the sense that, okay, what happened in between? Why are you referring to something that is so old, right? Is there nothing going on in that field? So does that mean that field is not relevant in today's age, or is it saturated, right? So for example, there's a field called routing in wireless sensor networks. There's a pretty saturated field. There's so many work there, right? It is really hard to come up with something that is novel. Because even before novelty, because anytime you publish something, you have to prove that what you have done is actually unique compared to what exists in the field, right? But it is not always about uniqueness. Your research needs to be problem-driven in the sense that what you're doing is actually required in the field, and then you try to come up with something that is new and unique. So when you are doing your original research, it's not just sufficient to come up with something that is novel, but it is also necessary to justify the need for that particular solution. So there has to be a problem that you're trying to solve. So always keep in mind that research in its core, structure needs to be problem-driven and not method-driven. Because there is a craze right now about ML and data science, right? Every field that you see requires a machine learning engineer, data scientist, data analyst, and all those things, right? Those are all methods. And within that, yes, of course, you can research how to improve the methods. There is no doubt about it, right? But when you're trying to formulate a problem, your research, if it is in a method-oriented domain, then that better be a call to you that you're trying to improve the method itself. If you're just using the method as an application to solve something, then whether your research is relevant or not needs to be problem-driven and not method-driven. So you need to be careful not to fall into this trap of thinking that you're doing an applied research, but you're saying that you're doing method-based research. And just to give you some idea, right? So anyways, typically for a field that is hot or viral, whatever you want to call it, I personally, it's a subjective case-by-case thing, but I look at the first 5 years first, right? Half a decade, see what's going on, see what is happening, right? So always kind of put a range on this, okay? Or you can put specific dates and stuff like that. And two options that is given is that you can either include patents, doesn't help me that much, okay? Unless you're doing specifically something with respect to development that requires you to check the recent patents, right? Or you have a plan that you would want to patent your work later on, okay? That is also an option. Or you can just leave it as the default option, that is you include the citations, right? So for everything that you see, you will have different types of options here, okay? So here there's a Hadoop case study based on clusters and stuff like that. So this is the reason why I was discussing, coming back to the point that we started off with, the title, the authors, right? Affiliation, the venue and the year, right? So this is the initial filter for you to like kind of grab a lot of different papers and then decide what to do with it, right? So initially you need to have some sort of check, right? So here you can see you have the title. And when you read this title, it should tell you something about what the work is. So here, if I read on energy efficiency and performance evaluation of single board computer-based clusters, a Hadoop case study, this tells me a lot about what this paper could be about, right? So that is why the title is important. If I give some kind of quirky title, then that is a problematic issue because I cannot use that as an initial filter to shortlist papers that I might be interested in, right? So that is why this is kind of important. If later on you find this paper to be interesting and very relevant to what you are doing, then of course you can go and visit these researchers' pages. As you can see, there's a hyperlink to both of the authors, right? And you can see what other work they have published to get a quick link to other relevant work instead of scouring the internet and trying to find something that is relevant, right? The journal tells you a lot about it because not all journals are good. Well, not all journals are equally good. There are tiers that the community has accepted as being high tier, and then there is intermediate, and there is low to intermediate tier, right? Anything below that is not considered to be reputable. So if a venue does not have reputation, your work as a peer-reviewed published work will not hold reputation or weight either, right? So it is always important for us when we are doing publications, if you do plan to do a thesis, or if you do plan to do a PhD later on. Is there any PhDs here in the room? Kind of. All right. Anyways, so if you ever enjoy doing this, and if you plan to take on a PhD, then these knowledges help, right? To make sure that you publish in good journals, strong journals, or strong conference papers. Computer science is an exception compared to the other fields because in our domain, some of the conferences are considered to be as difficult as journals, right? So that is the only exception that computer science has compared to other fields, because in other fields, journal is the topmost venue that you can publish in, right? And conferences are generally treated as work in progress publication venues, where you don't give like a validation of your work and stuff like that. But in computer science, some conference tiers require you to give like a fully furnished paper, right? That's a weird phrase to use, but you get the idea, all right? So anyways, and when it has been published, of course, that is with respect to the relevancy of your research. That is why it is important, right? Too old of a paper, you need to ask yourself, why are you reading this? Or why are you using that as your reference, okay? So anyways, once that is done, what comes right after that is the abstract. Okay, an abstract basically introduces you to the domain of the work, okay? It introduces you to what problem the paper is trying to solve on a very high level, what method they have used, and how their paper is good from the perspective of the lens of the authors, right? So once you skim the internet and use these factors as an initial filter to grab, let's say 20, 30, 40, whatever amount of paper, each one of you, if you spend 30 minutes, grab 40 papers each, that's a lot of paper to skim through, right? So what comes after that is you have to give a quick read of the abstract to further decide whether this paper is what you thought it was, right? Because initially you will have some sort of idea based on the title that, hey, maybe it's good, I don't know, right? But when you read the abstract, that essentially establishes the fact a little bit more, right, to your understanding that whether this paper is actually relevant or not. And then you can do a further decision-making, whether to discard that paper or whether to keep, okay? So after abstract, these are questions?
Yes, so I just wanted to check, you were going about like the research papers. Are we supposed to include the related work, or is this just looking at research papers throughout like our work?
This is in general, because this is something that a lot of the groups have to go through when they're doing their project as well. So once they do that collection of research paper, then they have to read those research papers to see if they're relevant or not. So we are basically merging a discussion on how to perform literature survey as well as how to read a paper. So it's applicable to both project as well as your research papers.
Okay, but we're not going to include a related work section in the research.
Or just the research paper presentation? No, there will be no citations or related work section. Your critique would be on the work section. Short.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So after the abstract comes the actual body of the paper. It starts from there. So you will have the introduction. Okay. Followed by sometimes most of the papers will talk about related work right after that. So the authors essentially have to show an understanding of the state of the art from their perspective, right? It is assumed that if you don't understand what's going on in the field, you are incapable of, proposing something that would extend the field, right? And get that understanding, right? So that is why related work is there. And that is the whole goal of any related work in a research publication, is to show your command, your understanding of what this field has done or what has been achieved in this field, right? And where you are positioning your work compared to that, right? After that, sometimes some paper will have a background section. Okay, this background section could be about any kind of like mathematical background that is required or that you need to convey to users, well, readers, essentially, for them to be able to understand whatever you have proposed, right? So if you're working on encryption and stuff like that, and if you're proposing an encryption protocol, or you are adopting an encryption protocol and then kind of modifying it for your purposes, you cannot assume that everybody knows what proposal you or what protocol you're referring to. Right? Even the most simplest one, a good research paper is about reaching out to a wider set of audiences. And in general, also, this philosophy applies that whatever you develop, software or whatever it is, right, web, mobile app, you need to keep in mind a broader set of audiences and not your niche set of audiences, right? Because if you can reach out to a wider set of people, it will be well received, so to speak, right? So anyways, so that's where the background gives. Some people just say what the background is about and tell you that, okay, this is what we're discussing. Or if you're building this work on a previous work that you have already published, then sometimes people talk about their own work here, their own previous work, if it has a very high degree of relevance to what this paper is going to discuss about. And then after that, you will see a section that is known as proposed method. Okay, and then following the proposed method, you will have your results and discussions. Sometimes these are treated in two different separate sections. Sometimes they are merged into a single section, depends on how the author has structured it. And then finally, you have a section for conclusion and then future work. Okay, again, these two sections, sometimes you will see to be separate. Sometimes you will see them merged together in a single section, conclusions and future direction, or a section called conclusions. There is a section called acknowledgement. I'm not writing that because there is nothing worthwhile in that other than saying thanks, right? So I'm pretty sure you will get the idea once you see that, right? So we don't have to discuss that. All right. So if we kind of boil this down, so essentially what it becomes is the important sections that you will see is basically the intro, the related work, the method, the discussion, and then conclusion and future work. There's not much there, but sometimes it's useful to know what can happen after this, right? Just to get an idea, right? So essentially, there is an acronym, quirky acronym that is there to reflect the structure of such papers that is known as IRAD. Okay, so essentially, what you have is intro, and then you have your related work, and then analysis and discussion is basically these two sections. Okay, so this is the typical structure. And when you do create your presentation format, right, this is the thing that you need to convey, right? These are the different sections that you need to convey. All right, so let's talk about each section. So does everybody have a clear understanding on when you structure your presentation, what will be the subsections? Yes, so you will have the intro, related work, okay, followed by proposed method, results and discussion, and then that's it. At least for the paper. Because after that, you need to include your critique at the very end. Your critique. Okay, so this will be what? How many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 subsections of your presentation, right? So necessarily, you will not be dividing equal time for every subsection. It doesn't mean that just because you have 5 subsections and then you will give like 8 minutes for each section. No, it actually is reflected by what the content of the paper is. Okay, so let's understand a little bit more in depth, like what each section is supposed to cover in an ideal scenario. Not, everybody doesn't do that, right? There is nothing wrong or right about it. It's a subjective thing, but what is expected? The generic expectation. So let's start with the introduction. Okay, so the typical structure of the intro, there are many multiple paragraphs that you will kind of encounter when you're reading a research paper. Okay, so let's say we break it down paragraph by paragraph, what the content is or what you're going to learn from a paper or an introduction section when you read it according to paragraphs, right? So typically, and remember, this is generic. Doesn't necessarily mean that you will find it in every paper, but you can expect something similar. All right. So the first paragraph that you work on is basically going to be a general introduction of the domain. All right. It introduces the reader as to what the domain is about, right? And then it ends with, or it concludes with, the challenges, right, that is present in the domain. So basically, you're setting up the groundwork or segueing into what you are interested in solving, right? So essentially, if you work on, let's say, IoT security or something like that, and assisted by cloud computing domain, right? So you introduce your umbrella domain, the topmost domain, right? Could be cloud computing. Then you talk a little bit about IoT and how it functions and stuff like that. And then after a quick introduction, you move into essentially the challenges that plagues IoT assisted by cloud computing, something like that, right? So the way I like to call this is when you write the intro, you have to write it as an inverted pyramid. So that means you start from general information and kind of narrow down step by step and make it, relevant to exactly what you're trying to do. And we will see how it kind of merges into that, right? So when you start with the second paragraph, essentially what I like to do here is talk about the motivation of the work. So because I ended with some of the key challenges that is present in the particular domain, right? Right at the beginning of the second paragraph, I don't want to lose that flow of idea. I will pick exactly the challenge that I'm talking about, and I will talk that as a motivation for me performing this work, right? And when I do the motivation, I like to give real world examples, right? Okay, and the reason behind it is that you don't want to do something that is imaginary in nature, right? This is not a science fiction. You're not trying to do anything like that. So if you want to tell the readers, essentially what question you're trying to address is why this research is important, right? Essentially this is what you want to convey when you are doing your motivation section, right? Because sometimes people might ask you, if you're doing your own work and you're trying to defend it, is why should I care about your work? It might sound a little bit rude, but it's a very valid question. Why should I invest my time and energy into listening to what you have done, right? So essentially, this is where you have to defend the importance or the need for your work. And when you think about importance, when you think about need, another word for that is essentially what motivated you to undertake this, project, essentially, right? So without real world examples, you cannot express the need for it, right? So when you give real world examples, or when you're reading the paper, what you're expecting to read for or write essentially is actual examples that kind of elaborates on the challenge that is present in this field, or the challenge that you're talking about, right? So paint a picture with words about a real world scenario that will help the readers understand that this is required. This is important. Okay. This is the only time for storytelling. Okay. And make sure you are good at it, right? As good as you can be. Right. So that's paragraph 2. And then when you start paragraph 3, at this point of time, people are aware of what your domain is, what are the challenges, what challenge are you interested in, and why that is important. Right. So what do you want to go right after this, the flow of ideas that you want to take your direction, okay, is basically what have other people done to solve this challenge. Right. So you talk about relevant existing literature. Okay, you can talk literature, or if somebody wants to say related work, you can also talk about related work, right? So this is essentially important is because it could be a situation where you're working in a field where others are also trying to address that challenge. So you need to talk about what people have done, okay, what others have done, and their shortcomings. Essentially, you want to talk about this, right? So maybe their latency is too high, or their computational complexity is too high, right? The algorithm that they have proposed runs in square time, and you can do better, something like this, right? And it is necessary to do better. This is one question that people easily forget, is there's a lot of work which says that, this algorithm runs in, gives me a latency of 15 milliseconds. I have come up with a solution that gives a latency of 8 milliseconds. So then they do a percentage and say that we have achieved this much percentage improvement. But there's a very intricate question here that stands here, is that, does it need that improvement? is from a functional standpoint, from a problem standpoint, is 15 millisecond bad? Because if there is nothing wrong with it, what are you achieving doing that 8 milliseconds? Because whoever uses your protocol, they have to go through the entire revamping process of actually applying a protocol. That involves cost, effort. Why should I undergo that if there is no necessity for it, right? So make sure that when you write the motivation, you actually address those points. Right? That is why you need to talk about it, right? So once you do the shortcoming, there should be a logical flow right after this to para 4, right? Essentially para 4, which I like to call it as research objectives. And what this essentially means that what are you proposing to address the shortcomings? And what do we mean when we say shortcomings? We essentially are talking about this last discussion, because there has to be a flow. You cannot just, talk aimlessly about everything, right? So you talk about the research objective on how you're trying to solve. What are you trying to achieve? That is going to be a little bit different than your problem statement, okay? Problem statement essentially kind of reflects through the title of the work, exactly this is the problem I'm trying to solve, right? But then there is a question of how do you plan to solve it? So there are a few things, right? So there is a question of what is it that you're trying to solve? Why is it important, right? And how do you want to solve it? So this how part is what this solves, right? This why part is addressed by these two paragraphs, 2 and 3, right? And then this what part you can either choose to address at the beginning of motivation 1 before you start with the real world example, or you can talk about the end towards the end of para 3, wherever you choose to, but essentially that information needs to be present, right? And once you're done with this, essentially para 4 kind of ends, right? And then you end it with the explicit list of contributions to the field, right? In a lot of papers, you will see that towards the end of the introduction, you will see like a bullet list where people talk about, we have developed this protocol, we have developed new simulation parameters, those kind of things, right? So that is essentially what they're trying to say, is that this is the new thing that they have added to the field. This doesn't exist before that work was done, right? So this gives you a clear picture of what will you stand to learn if you read this paper, right? And same goes when you're writing the paper, you have to make sure that whatever you write here is something that is relevant. After this, you find some papers give like a summary of the structure, summary of structure of the rest of the paper. Personally, I find that optional because it really doesn't convey that much of an information, right? I can shift through the paper and I can see what there is, right? I don't have to read again 6 or 7 lines just telling me that section 2 has this, section 3 has this. It's not a book, right? So I don't need to have that information, but to each their own. Some people like doing that. That gives it structure. Others like me, I'm neutral about it, right? I don't have a very strong feeling about it or against. Okay? But you might find this when you're reading. Okay? So when you present your introduction, essentially this is what you need to clarify. And introduction is one of the most essential sections when you're presenting any paper that needs to be touched on. Yes.
With regard to the number of contributions, what do you think is a good number?
There is no good number. It could be 1, it could be 5.
Okay.
Right? But you have to ask yourself, what have you done? And then if that is your original contribution, you express that as contribution. So still to give you an answer, on average, you see around 3 to 4. Right? But you can see less. There is nothing wrong with it. Right? You can see a little bit more than that as well. But not more than 6 or 7. That's something that I have not seen yet, right? So on average, it's around 3 to 4. You will see that, okay? All right, where okay. So when presenting the paper, what I want to know is these 3 factors. What is the paper doing? Why is it important? And how do they plan to address it? Right? So once you understand, and hopefully, if the authors have followed something similar to this structure, and they will in different formats, right? This is a good example of polymorphism. Okay, but if you find it, once you get that drift, your life will be easier when you're working on your project as well, because there you have to read more than one research paper, not just a single research paper, right? So this, you can think of the research paper presentation assignment as your practice run. Get a feeling of how you need to deal with your project survey, right? Because you still have to collect papers. Okay, and this is relevant to academia. Industrial white paper are a little bit different, right? So we're not going to talk about that right now. We're talking about academic papers, right? So that is the section 1 or subsection 1, your introduction presentations. All right. Related work. The second subsection is quite simple. The two important things that related work needs to convey is what has been done in the field. And remember, there are two different aspects of related work that will show up in the paper, or that typically should show up in the paper. Right here, when we were talking, we discussed about relevant existing literature. This is not related work. This is to find the works that are most relevant to what you are doing, or the most important work, right? Or the consequential works, and just talk about that. So that will be limited to probably 3 or 4, or even less, maybe 1 paper. Right? So this is not an extended discussion of what has been done in the field. So don't confuse yourself with that. This is just to point the fact that the challenge that I'm working on, right, has been probably dealt with by these papers, and this is what they have proposed, and this is what the shortcoming is. You don't summarize the paper, you don't talk in deep about the paper or what the paper is. All that goes in the actual related work section. And in the actual related work section, we talk about the works that is present in your domain. Maybe very relevant, maybe less relevant, but you need to discuss if there is any sort of relevance. That is what the important part is, right? So that's why you have to discuss about what has been done in the field, okay? And then the other thing that you need to talk about is basically how does your work differentiate from existing works. So here you need to do a little bit more in detail discussion about a comparative analysis of what you're proposing and how that is different from all the related works that you have discussed, right? Existing works. So the related work needs to conclude, the section needs to conclude discussing how the work that you are either reading or your own work differs from what already exists in the field. A comparative analysis on a higher level, not in depth, but a higher level, because you're not doing a survey. Survey paper needs to go to the, right? So when you're writing, just to give you an idea, there is a structure that kind of merges the concept of storytelling into scientific papers. Scientific papers are a little bit very rigid, right? It puts you to sleep sometimes. Okay, not all the times, but chances are it might happen, right? So there is this acronym that we had learned during our coaching sessions called ABT. Okay, what it stands for is basically and, but, therefore. So that allows you to kind of integrate storytelling into scientific writing. So what you do is you write 2 sentences or 3, 4 sentences. There is no restrictions on that using this. So what you do is sentence 1 and sentence 2 and sentence 3, full stop, but sentence 4, sentence 5, full stop, therefore sentence 6, right? So let's say you're trying to express these 2 points using this idea logic on one paper, right? So you start off the paper and you say the authors have proposed XYZ protocol in the domain of ABC, full stop, and the protocol uses the security scheme of, let's say, RSA, public key cryptography, whatever, full stop. And you don't have to keep on putting and, full stop will also act as an and, right? And the authors have achieved an efficiency of X%. However, so that is the but part of it. So you have now expressed or introduced the paper, you have given some background. However, the paper only simulates the platform. They have not used it in a real test bed situation, right? the data that they have used in order to validate their protocol is synthetic in nature. So that's the context of the but part of it, right? Or the however part. Therefore, in order to address the shortcomings of the paper, we have developed a test bed using real data and real protocols. We will be validating our scheme to check out the effectiveness of what we do. Right? So it's very short, it's very sweet. You don't have to think about what you need to write, right? And it makes the life a little bit easier because now you are narrating a context rather than figuring out or rather than throwing numbers at your readers. Okay, so when you're reading as well your research papers, when you're reading the research, the related work section, these are the two things that you need to keep in mind. This is what I need to extract from the paper and understand. That is what has been done. And how does this paper that I'm reading about, how does that differentiate from what has already been done as presented by the authors? So this is a good place, if you don't understand things, to come up with critiques. Essentially, sometimes not everybody might write a detailed related work section. So this is one of the areas where you can find a book if you don't achieve what you are trying to extract from this. Okay. All right. After that, I'm not going to talk about background. Background is well background. There is a background, just write the background, whatever math solution that they have given, right? What comes after that, the major section, is the proposed method, right? Essentially, what this section needs to, or what you need to run on from this section or extract from this section is details on the technical method. Okay, and this will involve what the system model is. Sometimes people call it as system boundaries, application boundaries, okay? But essentially what the assumptions are, okay, if there are any, is pretty important because sometimes you can question a particular work on certain grounds that they are not trying to cover, right? So if they express that in the system model, then you should not question it. You can point it out that that is something, but you will always have a discussion about how rational their assumptions are, right? If I assume that the sun rises from the west, well, of course I assume, but that's not a rational assumption. I cannot defend that assumption. Physics proves me wrong, right? So in computer science as well, there are a lot of assumptions that you can make for the works, right? But you should be able to defend that whatever assumption you have made, that can actually hold true, right? So that should be expressed in the system model or system boundaries, okay? What your system can and cannot do, all right? And then after that, if you're working on security, specifically security, then what follows is basically an attack model, sometimes which is also known as a threat model, which talks about, again, the assumptions with respect to security measures, security protocols that we're going to be implementing on your work. What is the assumed capabilities of the attacker? Not every attacker can exploit everything, right? They need certain resources and expertise on their side as well to do the hacking part, right? So there are different levels of that, right? So you need to talk about what you consider to be the different attacks. You need to consider what type of attacks you're trying to defend against, right? So if you're reading a paper that's on security, this is a pretty important thing, right? It may not be expressed as a subsection or something like that, but you need to get an idea on what the different aspects of an attack model or a threat model is, which is basically what are you trying to defend against? What assumptions have you made with respect to the security protocols and the capabilities and expertise of the attacker? That is the important part, okay? Then the actual meat, okay, of the section, which is the proposed solution. Exactly how they have done it. So you will need all the technical details. Okay, this is not high level anymore. Here you have to talk to your audience only. When you're presenting, you have to talk to your audience. Okay, you can simplify your narrative so that people who are outside the domain might be able to understand it better. That is something you can do, but this is the only section that you cannot go high level. Okay, it is imperative that you discuss technically what has been done. All right, so this is another area where you have to spend a little bit of time when you're presenting. Right, you need to make sure that you actually convey all the details. All right, after that, you have the results and discussion. Okay, here you need to talk or extract. The first thing is basically the experimental or simulation setup. Okay, this is very imperative. Before you start discussing how you got the results and stuff like that, you need to discuss how did you actually set up your simulation or your experiments, right? You need to talk about your devices, you need to talk about the systems that you have used, whatever parameters that is there. You need to talk about the performance matrix after this. Okay, that is based on what metrics or what parameters are you evaluating your proposed method, right? Your solution, there has to be something, right? We discussed about that a little bit. And then actual results. Results and discussion. Now, the way I like to call this should not be evident to the eyes. And what I mean by that is, let's say you have a graph like this, and you have some x-axis and some y-axis. Okay. And then there is this graph that goes like this. And your discussion is, as you can see from the figure, our performance improves with whatever this parameter is. I can see that too, right? But you are the one who actually did the experiments. So what can you tell me more about it? That is not evident from this graph. Does everybody understand what I'm trying to say? That is important when you discuss. You can present the results, whatever your results are, right? But you need to discuss something that you, as the person who did that experiment, knows, rather than me as the reader who can see what is going on, right? So rather than telling me that, oh, you know, the complexity of the system is linear in nature and you give me a graph, I can see that. What more can you tell me about it? That shows, or that reflects on you well, right? That you have this, what do you call that? An eye for detail. Is that the phrase?
Observant.
Observant, but there is a more quirky phrase for it. You have a eye for detail. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, so that's what you should talk about, right? Maybe there is a plateau here, and then it rises again. So tell me more about this. I don't know about this part. Or maybe there is a sharp dip and then it rises. So tell me about this window here. What is happening here? I'm more interested and curious about this. The rest I can see, right? So when you are critiquing the paper, when you research paper presentation, when you're critiquing the paper, this is also a possible area where you can find some shortcomings if it's not to your liking, right? Because essentially, at the end of this results and discussion, after you have read this should convince you that whatever the authors have proposed initially, that was their objectives, is actually validated. Make sense? So this should be able to validate the research objectives. That is what is important. So if you, as a reader, when you're reading your research paper presentation, if you fail to, if the author's paper failed to convince you that the results are actually validating their propositions, right? Then that is also a point for critique. But don't just say and leave it there that, hey, I was not convinced that what the authors did validated their objective. Now tell me, what do you think is missing? You read the paper, right? So you should have some little bit more understanding as to what is missing, what could have been expressed that could have convinced readers more or convinced you more. So you have to ask yourself that question. Nobody can answer that for you. You will not find that answer anywhere else. And that boosts your independent way of handling problems and to think. And that is what I mean by critiquing the paper. You critique the paper itself, not the domain that it's trying to. Make sense? So those are your structure of your presentation, essentially. And that is how you read the paper. And remember, when you write it as well, it's the same thing, but you're on a different side of the table. You write it using this formatting. Okay. Any questions? Online, any questions? Okay, I'll take that as a no. All right, so that clarifies how you are going to read your papers. That also discusses how you're going to look for papers when you do your project, how you're going to structure your presentation for research paper presentation. What is my expectation of that 40 minutes? Just to give you an idea, you must, as a presenter, make utmost effort in making sure that this one goes as well as possible. because no matter what a reader takes away from your presentation, they should at least know what are you working on, why is it important, and what have you proposed to do about it. Okay, typically, if you go into this field or any industrial field where you have to give presentations or pitches, they don't give you much time. Sometimes that is good, sometimes that is bad, but we have to play with the rules, right? Whatever the rules is. So no matter how good of a technical solution that you have come up with, it is not your goal to convey your technical solution, right? You can either choose to learn this the hard way through experience, or you can take it from me, which is coming from experience again, right? So what is important is to just convey, or convey in a very good fashion, these three aspects: the what, the why, and how. So take some time on introduction. Don't rush through introduction. Okay, that is one of the important sections. Once the introduction is done, and since the structure of this presentation is like 40 minutes, right? So you can take 15, 20 minutes, whatever it is necessary to explain well what the introduction is all about. Then talk a little bit about the related work, and then spend more time on this, cater to your own domain's audience if they want the technical details, because everything is like a teaser to the next section. The better you do in the initial sections, the more somebody will be interested to listen about what is next, right? So talk a little bit more after the introduction. This is where you should pay attention to, and this is catering to your own audiences, your tribe's audiences, people who are familiar with the work that you do, right? If it's machine learning, then you're catering to basically your community of machine learning engineers and scientists, right? So you should spend a little bit more time here. And then finally, you should spend time on this guy. Setup dictates a lot about what type of results you have been. If somebody doesn't understand your experimental setup, there is no way to evaluate whether what you have done is actually valid or not. So talk a little bit about setup, make sure that is clear, and then spend more time here, because these are visible. So I don't want to hear about, here is a graph that shows me this and that. I can see it. Tell me more about what I don't know. That is what I want, right? So spend some time on this discussion. Now you can decide, after you read the papers that you guys have selected for your group, to see which sections are relevant to that paper, and then decide upon how you're going to divide the 40 minutes. Okay, life will be a little bit easier there. Another thing, please make sure that everybody has a reasonably equal amount of speaking time. I believe this instruction is somewhere. I don't remember exactly where I have written this, but I'm just reminding every group that everybody needs to do their part. This is not a one-man ship. This is not like one of those car rides where the other 4 passengers are sleeping and this one driver is just driving the car late at night. No. Please don't do that. That doesn't look good, right? And it puts unnecessary stress on that one person. So don't exploit that person who's actually passionate about doing it. Don't be that person, right? So divide up the responsibilities that, hey, I'm going to read the introduction, I'm going to read the related work, and we will meet after 4 days and we will share whatever we have learned. If you're unable to explain your section, well, that shows. That will reflect something about the effort that you put in, right? But remember, even if you divvy up the sections amongst yourselves, you still have to know what is happening in the other sections. Because how will you know about the related work if you have no understanding of the introduction? So one thing that I would suggest to all of you is that everybody should read the introduction. Regardless how you divide up the work, everybody should read the introduction to know what is happening. That's the basic thing, right? It's in the section name, introduction. Okay, and then you can decide. I will read this, I will read that. Maybe after 4 days you meet and one person struggles with the proposed methods, technical details, so you can swap, right? The other person who read the technical now reads the related work, and because you have time, so utilize the time. There is no rush. 4 weeks are there, right? So thoroughly, polish your skills on how to read a paper and how to do a good presentation. Is that clear? How many undergraduates are currently in the class? 1, 2, 3. Okay. So, anyways, so any question? Does everybody understand what is expected? don't ask me this question. I went 46 minutes. Will I be penalized? I've explained this in the frequently asked question. Please read that. 40 minutes is a reference. Typically, a full-fledged research presentation is given 40 minutes. 30 minutes if you're in a conference, but whatever. You get the idea, right? So you decide. Can you convey all the information in the time that is given, right? Then that's fine. But then there are situations when I get emails like, I did it in 5 minutes. Is that sufficient? I don't know. Submit it and then I will let you know. Right? I cannot tell you what you have presented, right? I have to see that. And if I have to see that, I'm basically evaluating. Right? So don't. But if you have any questions, like I'm struggling or I'm challenged, understanding how to express this or how to present this, yeah, then reach out to me. Then I can meet you, I can walk you through, I can give you the ideas, insights, how to set up your work. Right? But don't ask me to pre-evaluate. Is that clear? Okay. It's okay, you can sit down. Anyways, so, all right, anything that we're missing here? Any lingering questions? I think I've expressed anything I can. All right, so the project, I already discussed it in the overview, okay? I'm being honest, the project is designed to create a sense of uncertainty. It has been designed in such a way, right? So you have to come up with your problem statement and you have to come up with a solution that will solve your problem. Okay, I have given an initial resource for every topic that you want to, work on. So start with that. That gives you a domain introduction on what the topic is about. Then the next step is to find more resources on that and read up. The project, if you slack off, you're going to struggle real bad. There's no doubt in my mind, right? So start early, stay on top of things. That's the best I can do. I will grade you on effort, but I need to see that effort. If I see there is no effort, and in the end you're saying like, I don't have a finished product, please grade me on effort. No, I cannot help you at that point. Right? So effort needs to start happening now, from the beginning, right? There isn't much exams here. It's just a conceptual exam that is going on here. So I want you to learn something of your own choosing and get good at it. I don't want to do that 2 hours thing here and like, right? But I will know what you have learned when I see your project outputs. So please make sure that you help each other to do a good work. That is important. And give you a heads up for every group work submission. Once the submission is done, there will be a window of 3 days where you will submit a peer evaluation as well. Not an end of class peer evaluation, but for every group assignment, there will be a peer evaluation. That peer evaluation would adjust the final grades of every assignment that is group based. Is that clear? Right? So work accordingly. All right. What's the time? 7:03. It's mostly about how to do research today's class. Anyways. So just to do a quick discussion, maybe we can fit in a little bit. Yes.
Our group was batting around the idea of a regular meeting with you. Do you think that there's value there, or do you think that we should just come to you when we have a problem?
So you want to meet with me weekly?
Yeah, or bi-weekly or whatever.
Yeah, sure. No problem. If any group, and it is suggested, wants to meet me on a weekly basis to get feedback on your progress regarding the project, you will need that. So I am more than happy to meet. Okay. Send me an email, or what we can do is I can share my time and you guys can pick a slot. Right. I'm open to meeting late, like late. I don't have any problems with that. Okay. So we can pick those times as well. All right. And maybe Saturday works as well. I don't like to enforce the fact that you have to work Saturdays, but for those of you who don't have any issues with that, I don't have any problem either. So I can give you some time slots. pick and choose. And then we can meet on Zoom, if that's all right. Okay. And bi-weekly, if you want to do, that's fine. Okay, so maybe twice a month we can meet.
Sounds good.
It's optional. I'm not enforcing it yet. It depends on how the progress is to phase one. If I see that I need to intervene, then I will intervene. Otherwise, I'll just let it be. Okay. And sometimes if questions are simple enough, then maybe what we can do is we can start like a chat server.
Yeah.
And then all the groups can post simple questions can be answered easier. You don't have to collect the questions again and again and meet. So what I can do is over a week, I'll just have a specific time when I will look all the messages. I'll just do like a housekeeping task of responding to everyone's messages. Okay. You can start that.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. Discord.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I'll keep that in mind. So things on my side is I'll start a Discord server, share the link with everyone. Please feel free to join. Okay. Second is I will upload the exam with the initial deadline, but open if you want to have a head start and incrementally do it. Okay. It has 12 questions, by the way. This will help. So initially it has been designed with the idea that you do 2 questions per day, takes you 6 days, and 1 day for revising everything else and then submitting on time. Okay, so that's basically the structure I had. And that's doable if you are staying on top with the lectures, reading the materials, looking at the lecture recordings and stuff like that. If that is the situation, then it should not take you more than 90 minutes to attend 2 questions per day. That's the investment of time. If you have not read anything till this point and you start reading while you are doing the exam, then it will take more than 90 minutes at that point of time. Right? So those are the 2 agendas on my side. Anything else? Am I forgetting anything? So we will finish the 2nd chapter this Wednesday, and the quiz will be opened. Okay, and try to finish the quizzes on time. 7 days is what I will give you. But if you need more time, but don't be that person. Like, he's gonna give it again. Okay. All right. So if everything is done, then I will see you all online Wednesday, 5:30. Okay, and we'll discuss then.